Okay. We have two other people going to be here. And I realize that this has like these lines, so I can actually make really, it helps me to draw the lines because I'm not very good at drawing lines, or these straight lines. But at any rate, we're going to, we started talking about international trade theory last week, so we'll go back and I'll go over some of that again. We'll just go over some of the things we talked about last week. There we go. And we get one other student. He should be here. He was one of my best students the first semester of last year, so I trust that he'll be here. At any rate, so we'll go over what we're going to do today is go over international trade theory. We started talking about it last week. I'm going to go over that material again today, just to get started. We're going to look at three explanations for trade. One, absolute advantage, where one country produces a good at a lower cost than another country, and therefore has an advantage. Mutual absolute advantage, which means that two countries trade because they both produce two different goods at a lower cost. But then the very important theory, a concept of trade that was introduced in the 19th century was the concept of comparative advantage. And comparative advantage says that a country that has a relative advantage should specialize in the production of a good and trade that with another country, and they should trade back and forth with each other on goods to which the countries have a relative advantage, relative, not an absolute advantage. In other words, the idea here is that it can be cheaper in some country A to produce both goods, and yet what comparative advantage tells us is that country B can still have a comparative advantage in trading some good that they produce at a relatively lower cost. And we say relatively lower because it has to do with opportunity cost. So we'll just go over that. We talked about this last time, David Ricardo, and we introduced Mr. Ricardo and his very important contribution to that. As I said, we talked about absolute, mutual, absolute advantage and comparative advantage. And then I introduced mathematically just simply what that is. Again, that just simply means that it's cheaper to produce some good X in country A than it is in country B. Mutual absolute advantage, these figures just simply mean that this is cheaper to produce X in country A, and country B it's cheaper to produce Y. And since that occurs, then they both trade. And then the concept of comparative advantage, in which some country has a relative, and that's relative to the production of another good. So the relative cost of producing here in country A, country A is good X. It's relatively cheaper for country A to produce good X. And here, it's relatively cheaper, and this is the same, you get the same expression. The same thing happens in country B, that if there's a good Y, and it's relatively cheaper for country A to produce good X compared to good Y, then it's also cheaper in country B relatively to produce good Y, more cheaper in country B than country A. So that's the concept of comparative advantage. And as I say, this has to do with the opportunity cost of producing the other good. That even if some country A, it's cheaper to produce both goods, then what comparative advantage says is that the country B, in fact, has a relative advantage, and that specialization should still take place. That's a very important point, is that we're talking about a specialization. That specialization, that means that countries focus on producing some good or a group of goods. So that is the concept of comparative advantage. And then we introduce, and then these are just mathematically some possibilities, including equalities. And that would also be the case. You could also have equalities that are going there. So then what we said, we have two countries, A and B. And what we're doing, and what we often do in economics, is we take, we make models, we quite often make models where they're similar, everything is the same except for the things that we want to focus on. The differences that we want to focus on, so we can see what the effect of those differences are. And that's quite often how we make models in economics. The models that we produce. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to take a simple model to show the effects of mutual absolute advantage and comparative advantage, and also the impact of trade. And so what we do that is we say, well, we have two countries, an A and a B, and they have the same land area. And you can see, in fact, these boxes are the same area, I'm happy to say. And then we'll say that they have the same population P. So they have some population P, they can live, say, there, they have some town there, they have, and then we say that they have some, there's some F, there's some food out there, some food, we just call it F, and it's wild, people can go out and pick berries and shoot wild animals and eat them, and it's just out there. People go and hunter-gatherers can do that, and there's enough food so that in each country the amount that each person gets is enough for them to survive. And that simply means that there's enough food, so if there's a total amount of food F and a population P, then we just simply say that F divided by P is some amount of food that the people get. And so everybody's the same, we assume everybody's the same, and so they have this F divided by P, that's enough for the population in each country to survive. So that's the very basic model that we're producing. They can also produce two other goods, and we call them wheat and mutton. This is, I believe, a classical example from the 19th century. I think they used wheat and mutton, so that's how I've done that here. So they can grow. There's some F. There's some F out there. F. And they can grow wheat, and they can grow mutton. And that's in country A, that for country A, wheat and mutton in country B. Okay. Now what we're going to say is that in the same way the food, which is some wild food that people go out and get, we're going to make an assumption that the people in the country, that they have a utility function, some utility, and it's of consuming the wild food, mutton, and wheat. That's just a utility function. That means that the utility, the happiness that somebody gets comes from consuming food, mutton, and wheat. Very simple, just a very simple statement. So they have some utility, and but the utility requires that the amount of mutton and wheat they consume must be equal. And why have I done that? I've just done that to make it simple. Just to simplify it, we simplify the analysis. We can make it unequal, but if we do, then that affects the amount of the results. And again, that's not important. So what I'm doing is I'm just doing that to make to make it very simple. And I've put some kind of form. I've actually made a functional form in this utility, this utility function. Oh, and yes, and the utility in both countries. Okay, so that's for citizens that's for citizens in country I, food in I, mutton in I, and wheat in I, and some I, and I equals A or A. Okay. Now, so now I've actually given a functional form to that. Plus, what this means is that, and this just simply means that as there's more wheat and mutton consumed, there's less that the people in these countries substitute the wild food for domestic food. So they substitute wild food for domestic food, plus, and also that's less than one, and that means that the consumption of F is reduced by 2 units. That's less than 1, so the increased utility comes directly from that. There's nothing don't worry about that. I'm just putting that just so you can see exactly that there is some utility function. That's its form. I made some very simple assumption. I've also assumed that this F over P is large enough that any positive output of W and M that can be produced in the 2 countries, it's always positive. That's not necessarily the case, but we don't necessarily have to have that assumption, but it's again so that we're not focused on the functional form. For the 2 greater than 0, then the utility of consuming some amount of wheat and mutton is greater than the utility of not consuming. So people are better off. Basically the more wheat and mutton they consume, the happier they are. So that's basically it. And if you put that into this form, you'll see that if you take these rules and you put numbers in, you'll see that as W and M go up, then the utility increases. So this is some very simple assumptions, and also we're assuming no immigration, so that people can't move between the 2 countries. If one country turns out to be better, we're assuming they're on some island. It's hard for people to get on the boat and move. Now what's curious is we're going to assume they'll be able to trade, but they can't move between countries. But hey, they're happy to trade goods, but they're not happy to have each other's citizens. So now we're going to look at the case where there's no trade. The countries don't trade, and they have some mutual absolute advantage. And what I've done here, I've just made a very simple model. Just put some numbers. It can look a little bit complicated, but all that it really means is that country A, in the production of wheat, country A is 2 times the efficiency of producing wheat as country B, and country B is 2 times the efficiency in producing mutton. For some reason, the lambs like the grass that grows here better, and so they can grow more of them. And here the wheat, the soil is better for the wheat, so that there's more wheat. So that's what these numbers mean. That means the total 1,000. There's 1,000 square kilometers in each, and the same in this country. So we have the same land area. Let me just get that. Okay, so the same land area. So again, we have wheat more efficient in country A, mutton more efficient in country B. That's the kind of basic setup that we have. These represent, as I say, 1,000 square kilometers, so the total land use must, each country must add up to 1,000. Okay, that's very, that's very basic. And so, and also, but a very important point, as we've said, and this is why I made this kind of simplifying assumption, if we assume that the people have to consume the same amount, then the production of the two goods have to be equal in the two countries. So the production of wheat in country A is 1,000 times the land area devoted to wheat, and that must be equal to the land area devoted to lamb times 500. So 1,000. So you can see that's twice as efficient. And country B, mutton is more efficient. And you can see that solving for those equations, if you solve for this, since they have to be equal and there's no trade, it's quite easy to determine. You just solve these, just use simple algebra to solve these. And what we end up with, not surprising, is that since mutton is less efficient in country A, then country A has to use twice as much. So twice as much land to produce the same amount of food, because they have to be equal. So you need twice as amount of land in country A. Country B, the same thing, but it's the opposite. The country B, it's less productive for wheat, so you need more wheat. So the thing that you can see right away is the countries don't trade. They don't trade, so it's not very efficient. They have to use more land for the least efficient product. They have to spend more resources, more of their land, because that's what the demand is. The demand, since citizens demand an equal amount, in order to produce an equal amount, they have to take up more land to produce the one that it's less efficient in. The production is lower. So so that's the basic idea. You can see right away, well, that's something inefficient. And what we're going to show is that if you trade, well, then the countries can gain by specializing. But let's just focus on the amount that's produced. And we can see that because the production of the two goods have to be the same, this is the total amount produced of the two goods. So it's 333,000, 333, 333,000, 333. I'll use up all the threes here. 333. 333. So, production is the same. The land area is double for mutton. Land area is double for wheat. So then what you do is you just simply would take. You can calculate. You plug those numbers in. And you can calculate some utility level. So what we also can see is that in the two countries, they're producing exactly the same amount. Total amount they produce is the same, because the way that I've set this up so that happens, which means that the utilities experienced by residents in each country are the same. And remember also that this is better. They're better off than if they just produce wild food. So they have wheat and mutton. So everybody's happier. So they're still happier. They're better off than if they were just out getting wild food. So that's the way that. That's working out. But now what we're going to do is say, okay, well, now what happens if we can trade? What happens if we can move goods back and forth? between the two countries. What should the countries do? And let's say what we're going to assume is that if the two countries can trade, and we're assuming that you put the goods on boats, there's no cost to trade. So that's an important thing to remember here. Is we're going to assume that there's no cost to trade. Now, so if we make these assumptions that the same production function and constraints are previously noted, and that the cost of transporting the two goods is zero, and we also, the citizens of both countries have the same utility functions, so we can basically just essentially treat the two countries as a single country. So that's to make it very simple. We just treat the two countries as a single country and combine the production functions for the two countries. And so we have some production of wheat in A and wheat in B, and this is the total. The production of mutton in country A and B, and here's the total. So it's the amount of land devoted to wheat in country A times 1,000 plus the amount of land devoted to wheat in country B times 500. It's less productive. The amount of land devoted to mutton in country A, which is 5 times 500, then the amount of land produced country B times 1,000. These constraints simply mean that the total amount of land in the two countries is 1,000, and also that the amount of the amount of wheat produced in the two countries must equal the amount of mutton produced in the two countries. Those are the constraints. So again, we've set that up so that we can focus on the most important issue, which is are there benefits to trade? And these are just done to make it very simple so that we can focus on that. So the terms in equation 5 are equal. That's 5. Let's go back to that. 5, those are equal because the total production must be the same in equilibrium. So we combine the production functions, and you can just do the algebra. I suggest that you just go through this and write all these equations out, and just satisfy yourself that this is true, that it produces the following equation. The production of mutton in the two countries must equal the production of wheat in the two countries. Then here's the land use constraints. So we want to find the maximum value of the output. That is, we want to find that use of land for the two goods that makes the above equation equal and provides the greatest utility. So we're going to use the land use constraints to set the above equation in terms of, let's just do it the output of M. We can do it for W, it doesn't matter. So let's just set these constraints, the land use constraints in that way. And then you substitute those back. Gives us the amount of land in the two countries that must be devoted to the production of good M. And the production, that must be devoted to the production of good M in equilibrium. They have to use 1,000. And they must devote the same. So they both have, in this model, they both have to use 1,000, must each be devoted to production the two goods to produce a utility maximizing equilibrium output of the two goods W and M in the two countries. So we put those 7 and 8 and 3 and 4 to determine the land, to determine these outcomes. That the land for wheat in B must equal to the area of mutton in A, and the land used for mutton in B must equal to the land area for wheat in country A. Okay. So the utility maximizing choice, you can see from 6. the utility maximizing choice of LMB and LAW is 1,000. In order to maximize this, all of the what we need to do, the maximum, to get the maximum of this, we just have to use all of it in A for W, because that maximizes it. If we use any, you can see that if you use any, this is a smaller figure, if you use anything in country B to produce wheat, then you're getting a smaller amount. The maximum, you get the maximum amount producing using all that. We get 1 million, so you use 1,000, you get 1 million, and the same thing here, you use all the land in B to produce mutton. So what we're showing here is that country B specializes in the production of mutton. So now we have a situation here, country B, all of the land is devoted to the production of mutton, and then all of the land in country A is devoted to the production of wheat. So you can just see that. You just see that produces 1 million. If all that is the maximum of this is 1,000 times 1,000 is 1 million. The maximum on this side is 1,000 times 1,000 is 1 million, and in fact they're equal. So that is the maximum figure, and you can see that now, where previously the two countries produced. If you remember, they produced 333,333. But now they're producing of each good, but now they're producing 500,000. Actually, they're producing, instead of 666,000 total, they're producing 1 million total of each good. So you can see there's more production. So if they can trade, if they can just trade across with each other, then that's the difference between this and this is the benefit from specialization, the gain from specialization, and the benefit from trading. So and so what can happen here now, in order to do that, country country B says, well, I have 1 million mutton. Well, I'll send 500,000 mutton to country A, and country A agrees to spend, that has 1 million wheat, and they agree to spend 500,000 wheat. And the thing that's important to remember is each country has the benefit, or they have the incentive. Notice here there's an incentive to trade. There's an incentive because the citizens in each country want the same amount of both goods. So the two countries have specialized, they want the same amount of both goods. The citizens are saying, okay, well we're going to have to give them 500,000 of our wheat so we can get 500,000 of our mutton. So that's the trade, 500,000 wheat, 500,000 for mutton. And notice we don't need to worry about, this is just a barter. We're not worried about the prices of the goods. We don't need to do that because in our assumption, we're just setting it up so that the two parties have an incentive to trade. They have that incentive because of the form of the utility, this in the utility function where the consumption has to be equal. So that if they specialize, they have an incentive to trade, and they gain from trade. So that is the benefit from trade. Now we're going to look at comparative advantage and no trade and comparative advantage. And now we're going to say that country A has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. Now we're going to look at a case where the two countries, country A has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. It's cheaper to produce both A and B, I'm sorry, mutton and wheat in country A. So, and the important thing to remember is that the wild food, this is okay because our initial assumption is that the consumption of wild food, F divided by P, is enough. So country A can be just, can be richer. It just says country A has richer soil, it's just a better, more rainfall, richer soil. It's just a better, it's a better country. So that's that than country B. So now we're going to look and see what happens in that case. We're going to, let's see, let me go back to 26, just to, the assumptions on 26. Yeah, those are 25, yeah, that's the assumption of 25. So those assumptions are the same. So those assumptions, the utility functions are exactly the same. Okay, right. All right, so now we've got the two goods. Country A produces 1,000 of wheat, and at this efficiency. Country B is more efficient in the production of mutton, but equally efficient as country A, but much lower in the production of wheat. So chances are rainfall is very low rainfall, or maybe too much rainfall. Whatever kinds of things that both could make that kind of situation. So so let's just write that down. That's 1,000. Each unit of land produces 1,000 A produces 1,000 wheat and 500 mutton. And here it's 250. Each unit produces 250 wheat and 500 mutton. So those are the assumptions we're making. So you can see that they're equally efficient in the production of mutton, but country A is 4 times more efficient, much higher yields in the production of wheat. So now we're going to talk about if there's no trade, and again you can see that these have to be equal as before, and we end up with very similar, in fact the same kind of thing, where since the country A is more efficient in the production of wheat and less efficient in the production of mutton, and again we end up with lots of land to produce mutton, and then the same thing here. The wheat is less productive. So we need to use 2/3. We need to use 2/3 of the land for wheat and 1/3 for mutton, and we use 1/3 of the land for wheat and 2/3 for mutton in country A. So that's the situation there. And again, that's an equilibrium because that means that everybody has the same. But what we can see is now we get a different outcome, and in this outcome, the amount of production of the two goods in country A is 333. 333, and B is 166,666,667. So you can see country A produces twice as much of wheat and mutton. The citizens are consuming twice as much, which means they're much happier, they're eating more, and they're happier. But both sides, both sides though are maximizing the utility. They're maximizing the happiness they can achieve. But this shows this country is just better off. This is a more prosperous country. Country A is more prosperous than country B. Now we're going to look and see what happens when trade is allowed. So here again, as before, we can essentially make the two countries, treat the two countries. I should essentially treat. I have to put the word treat in there. the two countries as a single country, and they coordinate the production, which coordinates production. Then we essentially treat the two countries as a single country, which coordinate the production of the goods in order to maximize utility in both countries. So the combined production functions are these, and then these are the constraints, and we can work all of that out. And interestingly, what we do, what we find out, and this is the interesting, the results are interesting because there's unequal production. So they specialize, but what we find out is they don't exclusively, the result is they don't exclusively specialize. Country A does use wheat. They're better off in the production of wheat. So remember, before they could only use 1/3 of their land. So now they can specialize, they're better off at it, and they increase the production of wheat and the production of mutton in country A. And then country B does just mutton. And this, the equilibrium outcome is country B just specializes entirely. They're so inefficient at producing wheat that there's no reason for them to produce it. So country A in this, in order to satisfy this condition in the two countries, country A still needs to produce some mutton. They still need to produce some mutton. So they have a total of, right? So the wheat is 666, 667, and then 166, they produce 166, 667, and country B produces 500,000 mutton. They produce 500,000 mutton. They send, let's see, they send 333, let's see, what did they, each one, they're going to send 333, right, they're going to send 333, country A, and country A is going to send 166. Is that right? No, they're going to send 333 of wheat to country B. That is the. Did I get no 250,000? I'm sorry, I got that wrong. It's 200. It's 200. They send 250,000. That's the. You work out the numbers. That's right. I worked this out before. I just forgot, but that was it. So they send 250,000. They have 250,000. So 250,000 plus 166, 666. 416, 666. They send 250,000. 250, subtract that, you get 416, 666. And they get 250,000 of each. Okay. So they consume country B 250,000 of each, country A 416,666 of each, and you can see that the gain afterwards is 416, 666, and 250. The difference between these two figures and those is the gain. This is this minus this is the gain from trade for country A. Country B, this minus this is the gain for country B. They're both better off. They're both better off after trade. Now notice, country B still has a lower, they are a poor country. So they're a poor country. The citizens have a lower utility level. They're not as prosperous because the land is less productive. They're trading. They have a disadvantage in there, but the citizens are better off. So they're better off as a result of trade in country A. The citizens are better off. So this is an example. It's the that shows this is the kind of thing that we use to show the benefits of trade. And so the point here is that this is this is a case of comparative advantage. So you can see that country B, even though country B does not have an advantage in either good, their productivity is equal for B. Remember I showed earlier, if you look at those conditions, you can have an equal. So that's what I've done here. Even though country B does not have an advantage in either good, they don't have an advantage in the production of either good. Country A has an absolute advantage in the production of wheat, and they're equal in the production of mutton. But what we say is, the way that we put it, is that A has a comparative advantage in the production of wheat, and B has a comparative advantage in the production of mutton. So it's a comparative advantage. So what we're saying. And so because of the comparative advantage, even though there's not an absolute advantage, but country B specializes in the production of mutton. And they trade. And we can show here, the numbers show that the two countries, in fact, are better off as a result of trade. So that's the outcome. It's a very clear. The numerical example is quite clear. And obviously, of course, what we're doing, we're assuming there's no cost to trade. We're assuming the two countries can freely trade. There's no other barriers to that. And so you get that outcome. But one of the interesting things is that economists over time, and in fact you had Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage was used, that concept was used in order to open up markets and create to increase the amount of trade in the 19th century. And as we'll see, the result of that ultimately, by the late 19th century, between 1880 and 1920, the European countries, as a result of the expansion of trade, there was an increase in income that had not been seen before. So there were clearly benefits to trade, but there was a problem. The problem is that economists by the mid-20th century, the mid and the late 20th century, economists were looking at the pattern of international trade, and they were seeing that the patterns didn't seem to be quite the same as comparative advantage, what would be predicted by comparative advantage, and especially like Paul Krugman. What Krugman noticed when he was studying trade data was he noticed how countries seemed to trade similar goods. They didn't seem to trade. They were trading similar goods. And that the advanced countries were engaged in a lot of trade with each other, and they were trading goods that seemed quite similar. And this didn't seem quite to make sense. That didn't quite what comparative advantage didn't explain that. And the reason is that comparative advantage really was an idea that in the 19th century, when the European countries wanted to import raw materials from colonies, and then export manufactured products. So, as we've shown, there's a mathematical sense, and it also was quite convenient. If you've studied world history of the 19th century, you're aware that the Europeans went out and colonized vast sections of the planet, not just Africa, but large parts of Asia as well. And then a lot of the trade was based on the colonization, and a lot of people feel exploitation. So what Dr. Krugman argued was that this concept of comparative advantage provided a good explanation for the world trade patterns before the First World War. And the classic was Great Britain. And Great Britain, as we know, established colonies throughout the world. They imported raw materials and exported manufactured products. They exported those manufactured products both to other developed countries and also back to their colonies. So that was the pattern of trade there. And as I say, he noted that Britain's trade was with primary product exporters with either high land-labor ratios, land to labor, or lower levels of economic development. So he came up with, he started thinking about this, and he came up with what we now know as the modern theory of trade. Now, and let's see, do we go over, I think we'll be talking about this a little bit later, well, no, we talked about this last semester, right? We did talk about this, so some of this is a repeat, but let me go over this for those of you that are new to the class. From 1880 to 1920, let me just erase this. 1880 to 1920 was a golden era of economic development. Well, actually, 1880 to about 1914, more precisely, because, oh, there it is. There we go. 1880, about 1880 or so, 1914. It could be a little bit earlier, 1870s. But this era, this was the gold standard. Major countries, and that was the UK, US, lots of other, France, a number of other major, Germany. Many major countries in Europe and North America were on the gold standard. So that means that the currencies were fixed. This helped to promote trade, a lot of trade in the world in this era. This, of course, was ended by World War I. That started in 1914. 1914 to 1918. We're now, that was now 100 years ago. The World War I had a tremendously negative impact on world trade. The gold standard, it disrupted the trade patterns that had been set up over the previous 30 to 40 years. And it also ended up creating what we call protectionist trade policies. So in what we call the interwar period, the 1918 to 1939 period, the interwar, there was protection. Protectionist trade policies. Countries put up trade barriers. The amount of global trade fell dramatically. And an interesting point, and Dr. Krugman, let's see if I write this, if I note this here. I don't think it's noted there, but Dr. Krugman makes an important point that the amount of global trade as a percentage of world GDP in 1914 was was greater than until that percentage of trade as a percentage of global GDP was not reached again until about 1970. So this was a more than 50-year, more than half a century, the effect of World War I in terms of disrupting trade, World War I and World War II in disrupting trade patterns, that although the global economy grew, the percentage, the trade as a percentage of global GDP. So that's percentage as a trade as a percentage of global GDP was greater in 1914 than it was until about 1970. It's a very interesting thing to realize. Now, I've been around for a while. I was born before 1970. So, when I was young, that was the world actually had not fully, from a trade standpoint, had not fully recovered from the beginning of World War I, more than 50 years ago. So, now the interesting, then, as we say, the liberalized trade agreements after World War II, so you finally had these liberalized trade agreements, that increased, dramatic increase in trade between nations in manufactured goods. So what Krugman noted was that after the end of World War II, from 1945 onward, that there was an increase trade liberalization and an increase in trade. And he was noticing the patterns weren't quite the same as with comparative advantage. So he noticed that. And what he said was he thinks that it has to do with localized geographical specialization from what's called increasing returns to scale. Some of you have had microeconomics. If you've studied what increasing returns to scale, just erase this. If you've not had that concept, is anybody not familiar with increasing returns to scale? Is there anyone that doesn't understand it? You do understand it. You don't. Okay, good. Well, this is important. This is a very increasing returns. This is a very, very important concept in economics. What that means is that the bigger you get, as say some output, some QX increases, that the cost of X the average cost falls. The more you produce more cheaply. Per unit, the average cost per production. And we call that increasing returns to scale. You'll also see this increasing returns, this IRPS, increasing returns to scale. You might see that. Very, very important concept in economics. So he noticed, he observed that. So he suggested that the localized geographical specialization from increasing returns to scale played a major role in the observed pattern of international trade from the end of World War II to about 1980, because this is when he started doing his work, for which he would eventually receive the Nobel Prize for. What we mean by localized specialization, let me write that down because that's an important term. Localized specialization localized specialization. That means that in a place, in some place, some very small area, a lot of firms come together. Firms can come together in one place, and as together they increase together, not just in a firm, but together they increase their output of a good, and then together this in the place for all of the firms that operate in that place. So that's what we're talking about here. This is what localized specialization. It means that this specialization takes place within in a local area, and the firms there could be a monopoly, but quite often there's a lot of small firms, and together they work. Together they produce and specialize. And what they do then is they trade with other locations. So they specialize, they produce that good at a very low cost. There may be relatively few places in the world that produce a good. And that's one of the things that he noticed, was that you were seeing these geographically concentrated industries. So what he noticed and these are concentrations of very specialized manufactured products in very specific geographical locations. Now there are numerous examples of this, and we'll consider those a little bit later. And that manufacture products for a global market. So you're talking about a global market that this kind of manufacturing takes place. And this is why, so what Krugman noted was that he saw this concentrated industries, and so it looked like they were producing similar goods, but they were different. They actually were different goods, but because they were very concentrated in a very narrow area, that was the kind of so they were specialized. So what he thought was that it appeared to contradict the theory of comparative advantage, because it's an absolute advantage. Because what we're talking about here, that's an absolute advantage. That's absolute. And in fact, what we've seen is there's a lot of production. The comparative advantage, you're talking about two countries that are trading with each other. And in fact, the comparative advantage is, once you get a third country, things can get very complicated. So the comparative advantage model actually did work very well for a country like Britain that had colonies and had a dominant relationship with those countries. And the theory said, well, this is how a country should specialize. This is different, because here you do get, because as the industry gets larger, the costs get lower, which means you do have an absolute advantage in the production of the good. So it's an absolute advantage in the production of the good. And this advantage may be global. And that's one of the things we're going to see, is that this idea. But also trade liberalization that took place that involved developing countries. So the world started changing a lot after 1980. And one of the major things, of course, the 1978, that China began to open up. You started the change in China began changing. China began opening itself up to world markets, and we've seen the tremendous growth in China since 1978. And this is an example of a country like China that took advantage of large pools of low-cost labor to specialize in labor-intensive manufacturing. So that's one of the things we've seen since about 1980, is that kind of growth, and that certainly has also had an impact on the kinds of goods that are produced in this country. For example, in this country, up until almost, 1990 or so, there was a lot of stuff was manufactured here and exported. There weren't a lot of finished goods that were imported. There weren't a lot of finished goods that were imported. After 1990, Japan, countries like China were producing so many goods more cheaply. China, Indonesia, Malaysia, all throughout Asia, the Japanese companies began building factories abroad, outside of Japan, and so to take advantage of the lower cost of labor in labor-intensive industries. So you've seen that tremendous change. It's caused a tremendous change in the types of goods that are produced. We've also have seen some social problems that have come from that. We talked about that. We did talk about that last semester. As I say, there's people who are new here. I'll have to work that into the discussion at some point. But that's what we had 2 students that were here at least today. Now we're going to talk about just to continue. One of the things that Krugman said was transport cost reductions. Transport cost reductions, it became cheaper to ship goods. Ships got much bigger. You could move more goods around more cheaply. Water is a great way is the cheapest way to move goods, of course, is water. And the ships got bigger and they got more productive. They could move more goods at a lower cost. That made it and manufacturing spread throughout the world. It became very possible for firms to locate production at various points in the world and take advantage of localized geographical specialization. So what Krugman believed as a result was the emergence of labor intensity and skill intensity in the manufacturing industry produced what at first appeared a re-emergence of comparative advantage as an explanation of international trading patterns. But he believes, Dr. Krugman believes, that comparative advantage provides part of the explanation, but the increasing returns, he thinks that increasing returns of scale play a more important role. So that you can see that there is comparative advantage, but that localized external economies may play a more important role. And I'm going to have an exercise that you can look at this and think about this and see whether this might be the case. I'm going to have you look at real data that you can get online from a very important source of data on products that are sold around the world. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about something called the New Economic Geography. I might add, Dr. Krugman worked with, he did a lot of work with my own professor that I studied graduate school with, Dr. Fujita, my dissertation supervisor. They wrote a lot of papers together, but he got the Nobel Prize. But at any rate, so as part of that, and in fact, his work with people like my professor in graduate school was part of what's called the New Economic Geography. Did we talk about Alfred Marshall? Do you remember that? I think I might have briefly talked about that last semester. Let me go over that. Marshall is one of the great economists of the late. He's considered one of the real giants in modern economic thought. And even it's almost 100 years after his death, his ideas are still very, very. What he wrote about are things that are just he could see some very important things, the way things work, that even though the economies have changed, that it is still very, very much a product of how economies work. So he's still considered a significant figure in modern economic thought. And what Marshall observed in the late 19th century was that related industry and skilled labor specialized, that in skilled labor that are specialized for such industries tended to concentrate in a single location. He noticed that there was this concentration, and it was a concentration that offered a constant labor market for skilled people and a pool of skilled labor. So it was a mutually beneficial relationship for the workers and for skilled workers and for the firms that employed those workers. So the skilled workers, so the idea was you have skilled workers and then firms employing skilled workers. So the firms that employ skilled workers, if they're in the same place, say they're in some place, they're concentrated in some place, you have a number of firms, they're concentrated in one place. And what happens is that the firms employing skilled workers can find the skilled workers, and the skilled workers can find employers. And that it's that there's a local market, there's local information, and this is true whether or not you have telecommunications, whether you have line, people in close proximity. This is still the case. This is still the case that when you're in the local market, skilled workers and firms employing skilled workers, it's just easier to find each other. It's today, because of the internet and communications, it's certainly possible to find people, for those connections to be made at a greater distance, but still concentration matters. Concentration still matters, and some people think it's actually more important as a result of communications. So this is the idea: skilled workers finding firms, and firms finding skilled workers. When they're close together, that makes that easier. So that's what he noticed. He just looked out in the world. He just observed. He observed the way the world worked, and he saw these patterns. Very interesting patterns that he observed. And here's the things. There are three primary factors common. He said that Marshall noted three primary factors common to such industrial concentrations. One was the presence of information spillovers. The spillover means if I pour water or liquid into here and it pours over. So there's what that means is that trade secrets do not remain secrets. Same thing of the Silicon Valley or investment banks. People change companies. When they change companies, much of the value is here. It's in their minds. How to do things, how to make things, how to calculate things, how to do things. So trade secrets do not remain secrets, and people leave existing firms. They may start related firms in the same local. They may start firms, go to other firms, but there's that exchange of information. That exchange of information. There's specialized suppliers. So when you have specialized suppliers, and this is one of the reasons why, as an industry grows in size, the cost, we've noted, increasing returns to scale means this. So one of the reasons is that as the industry grows in size, say that represents an industry, then, and one of the things we're going to, if you haven't seen this concept in microeconomics, as the market gets bigger, as the market gets bigger, then there's market size is important. The bigger the market, the more different kinds of services and products that can be demanded in that. That firms can efficiently serve that. For example, think about a very high quality restaurant, a very high quality, let's say a high quality sushi restaurant. You have a number of, there's a number, very, very high-end restaurant. How many of those kinds of restaurants, when you go out in the middle of the country, do you find? You don't. It's because, and the reason is that the market is too small. You need a big market so that there's people with enough money and also the interest and inclination to use those services. It's the same thing. If we took Ginza and we put it in the middle of the country, what would happen? We'd disappear. The reason why Ginza is there is because there's so many people in the Tokyo area, and they can go to there. People can go there, it can attract a number of people, and so you have all of that, those specialized retailers. So again, that's another example. Here, this is production. It can also work on the retail side. But so when the market gets larger, you can find more suppliers because the market is big enough, and so the suppliers themselves can become more specialized. So the suppliers become bigger, they become more specialized. As they become more specialized, then the prices, they have increasing returns to scale. They provide their services and products at a lower price. So the input prices go down as the market gets bigger. The input prices go down as the market gets bigger. The cost of production goes down in the industry as the size of the industry gets bigger. These are the kinds of things that can create. This is the kind of thing that Krugman is talking about. Another thing is a localized skilled labor market. Specialized firms demand specialized labor, and specialized labor enhances their own skills by working in that market. So when people come to work in a market like this, the firms are getting more and more specialized. That means they're getting better and better at what they do. They're producing more and more in finer, in a more targeted market. So they're getting the quality is maybe getting higher. The quality of what they produce is getting higher. So the workers get better at what they do. So workers get better. And as they get better, then they're more productive, which causes this to happen. So you can see it's what we call, it's a virtuous circle. It's what's called virtuous circle. So as it gets, the bigger it gets, the better it gets. Now, eventually what happens though with size, it gets too big and you get congestion problems and what are called negative externalities. That's the thing that keeps it from getting, at some point, you begin getting that. But you can see to a point, this is the process. And that's what's driving it. Such specialized industrial concentrations are often export-oriented, and this is the case today in many places in the world, as it was in the late 19th century. And in the late 19th century, that's what Marshall noted. He saw these concentrations in Britain. So what happened in the early industrial era, in the second half of the 19th century, was you had this explosion of these specialized local industries that you saw in Britain in the late 19th century. Krugman, 60, 70, 80 years later, was seeing the same thing, but we saw it in places such as in China. And one of the ideas, and an example, is the button. The button industry in a place called Chaotu in Zhejiang province. And Krugman notes that about 60% of the world's buttons are produced in one town. Now, I'm not sure if that's still, but I saw it, and the same play, the zippers. The zippers, these zippers, 80% of the world's zippers, so presumably 80%, that should probably every zipper on this bag, every zipper on your bag is produced in one place, and probably the same place. So we'll show you in just a minute how concentrated this place is, and in fact we're going to do that right now. You'll see how localized these specialties are in this Xiaotu are, and this is a place. And I apologize if I'm not pronouncing this correctly. Zhejiang province, there in eastern China, coastal China. It's, I believe, Shanghai is right there. I think Shanghai is there. So it's here, but it's in Wenzhou city, in the southern part of the province, closer to Fujian province, there. So it's there, so you got the province, but it's not in the province, it's in this city, but it's not in the city. It's, because here's the city, is Wenzhou city. It's there, that little place. So look at all this. That little place, and we'll see how small this place is. Let's see if we can get a scale here. I mean, we're talking about just, it's like probably 100 meters. Just probably something like that. So you're talking about this. Look how big that place is. It's not very big. You could probably take a bike from one end to the other in 30 minutes. That little place, this little place, all these factories produces the majority of the world's buttons, and the majority of the significant majority of the world's zippers. In that little place. One little place. And what happens is this. It's because the concentration enables them, they specialize, lower and lower costs, lower and lower production costs. They can beat the whole world. They can produce at prices that nobody else in the world can match. Nobody can match those prices. Just better. In one little place. One little tiny place. And this, you'll see, this is a very common thing that we see actually throughout the industrial world. You see these kinds of patterns. It's very easy to find them in China. And in fact, what I'm going to have you do, as an exercise, as I'm going to have you look up. There's a great place to, there's a wonderful, wonderful place to do this kind of research. One of the best places in the world to do this, to research these kinds of industries and find this concentration. It's online, and you can get it. You can start doing work very easily. All you have to do is go to Alibaba. Does anybody know Alibaba? You know Alibaba, sure. Alibaba is the site. You basically can buy and sell, sell anything, buy anything. They sell everything. It's a Chinese site, but it's a global. But basically, it's what is that? Jack Ma. Jack Ma is that's Jack Ma's. The same Ma as the. So Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, and you may not think about it as this is a great site to do this kind of research, because you can get on and the companies post information about how big they are, their address, their location, their address, their size, the goods that they produce. So what you, and what I had the students do last year, and I'm going to ask you to do this as well, go to Alibaba and find, and it's not hard because all you're going to do is you look up some very specific product, and chances are you're going to find it's just in one place, all the companies. You're going to find all these companies in one city and quite often in one district. And they're producing for the whole world. It's very easy to find. You don't even, you don't have to try hard. All you do is you write some product down. I was looking at like frames, glasses frames. I think there's some in Shenzhen. Shenzhen, there's some district. It's a district. It's not even the city. It's a district, and they produce a huge percentage of the world's production of glass frames. Just frames. You can just whatever product. I mean, you just type anything, and you'll find right away. And it's all amazing amounts of information. This is the kind of research that this is the kind of research. Say if you work for a company, I mean, this is the kind of research that you just naturally do, and just to research your markets, and these are things people do. This is a good exercise. Just to, it's a good job skill. To be able to look up and do this kind of stuff. So this is kind of really, I think this is the kind of experience that will give you just to get used to these kinds of site and this kind of information. We're going to do it for an academic reason, so you can understand how the world works, but it has a very practical skill as well. So next, I'm going to go. As I say, this is just one example. They're all over. They're all over. And it's not just in China. There's famous places in the United States, Britain, and there's many examples of this. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you a model of increasing returns to scale. And this is something, this is a graphical, is a graphical model. So I want you to try to, first, let's get used to seeing what we're trying to do. Let me check the time. We're almost out of time. We're running well. Well, I think that what I'll do is I'll just introduce what we're doing here. I'll have you look at this in the week. Let's just make sure. I don't think I have the exercise. No. I'll give you this exercise. I think you'll have fun doing it. I found it because I did it myself. I did it myself for an industry. It's just a great, it's just fun stuff. Any rate, this is I believe the word's an Edgeworth. I think this is what's called an Edgeworth box. The term. And what this shows, this shows labor. This box shows the use of labor and capital. So this is labor. This is amount of labor. Increasing labor and capital. Increasing capital. And so then we're going to look at various points, shows some firm, some individual firm or group of firms. Like that means a small amount of capital, a small amount of labor. If something is capital intensive and uses very little labor, it might be there, somewhere up there. If it's labor intensive, uses very little capital, that point uses a lot of labor and little capital. That's labor. That's labor intensive. So what we're and what this is these are the possibilities. What this represents, and the idea of the box is the box shows the total amount. This is some amount of labor. This is the available amount of labor. This is the available amount of capital. This is some use of labor and capital in the production of some good. So what we have here this is a model where there are three goods that are produced at constant. So three goods. We've got three goods A, B, and C. You say that they're producing constant returns to scale. That means that as Qx increases, Cx over Qx, it doesn't change, no change. So if this goes up, if it goes down, that's constant returns to scale. Increasing returns to scale is this. Decreasing returns to scale, the costs go up. So that's what that means. So we're producing constant returns to scale. And what this means is the line segments show this point is the amount of labor and capital used to produce good A. So that's the amount of labor and the amount of capital used to produce good A. So that shows there, so that goes up there. Industry produces, that's the industry produces at that point with that mixture of labor and capital. So there's more capital and labor. That means it's capital intensive. So industry A, we're saying, is capital intensive. Then B produces, and so what we're saying is all the available amount of labor and capital. So then B, so what that means is the total amount, there, A, this is the total amount of labor used for B. This is the total amount of capital used for B. Total K, total labor, and you can see it's about roughly the same. So we're saying we're calling that mixed. So that's mixed relative labor intensive, capital intensive, and then in this model, the rest of the inputs, labor and capital, are used in industry C. And industry C uses, the way we have it here, uses a lot of labor. C, a lot of labor and less capital. So this is labor intensive. So what we're having is we're having a capital intensive industry that uses a lot of capital and a small amount of labor, a mixed labor and capital industry, and then a labor intensive industry that produces C. So by doing this line, this says, these are the uses of the possible uses of the input to produce the two goods. We'll continue with this. What I wanted to do here was just introduce what the concept is. You can get comfortable. It's actually, you'll see, please, there's just a few more pages here. Study that. So go over that. So you just feel, you get a feel and understanding of what the concept that we're working on here. There's some very deep insights that you can come from using this kind of simple model. So please go over that. Let me check on the, and I'm going to give you the same, I gave it the class last year. I think it was a really good exercise. And I'll get that, I think I'll probably send that to you as well, and you can get working on that. As I said, Alibaba If you've never used it before, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating site. If you have, well, then you get a chance to use it for classwork. So thank you, and let's see. I haven't had did everybody send me the assignment? I got yours. I haven't had a chance to read yours yet.